Can you create better sounding music in GarageBand, which is free, than in the industry standard $600 Pro Tools? I don't only think you can, I know you can. Let's discuss. Welcome back to the Band Guide. I'm your band guy, Colin, and let's talk about Pro Tools. Pro Tools is awesome. It's the industry standard software for recording and mixing, but it's complicated and really expensive. Do you need complicated and expensive to create great sounding music? Absolutely not. Let's start this video off with a quote by the legendary mixing engineer Andrew Sheps. This guy's mixed for everybody: Adele, Green Day, Red Hot Chili Peppers, Lady Gaga, the list goes on and on. Andrew Sheps said, "The only thing that matters is what comes out of the speakers." He said this to set up a great speech at the University of Oxford. I'll link to it in the description below. His major point here is that once a sound comes out of the speakers, you cannot control what the end listener is going to think. They'll either enjoy it, hate it, or somewhere in between. You can't explain what you did or used to make it sound great. And even if you could, they wouldn't care. They're either going to enjoy it, hate it, or somewhere in between. He goes on to say that the gear doesn't come out of the speakers. No one is going to know what gear you used. They won't know if you recorded a live drum set or used drum samples. They won't know or care if you recorded a real guitar amp with a microphone or used a virtual amp simulator. And they definitely won't know or care what software you made your music on. The only thing that matters is, did you make something that comes out of the speakers that they can enjoy? So let me ask you this: which one of these do you enjoy more?
Instead of crying at the table, instead of giving out the names, instead of lying that you're stable, instead of pushing it away, and you say it's true. Instead of crying at the table, instead of giving out the names, instead of lying that you're stable, instead of pushing it away, and you say it's just to get out, yeah, it's just to get out of the figuring. And now you're saying you're proud, yeah, you're saying you're proud. We're all getting sick of it, yeah. Just to get out, yeah, it's just to get out of the figuring. And now you're saying you're proud, yeah, you're saying you're proud. We're all getting sick of it, yeah.
I mean, it feels pretty obvious to me, but let me know which one you prefer in the comments below. Can you guess which version is which? Well, version A is the original version that I recorded and mixed in Pro Tools nearly 7 years ago. Version B is the exact same song, same vocals, same synth, same bass guitar, but I retracked the electric guitars using GarageBand's amp designer and recreated the drums using GarageBand drums, and then I remixed the entire song using some better technique. And that's what I want to drive home. It's more about how you use what you use than what you use. In the last 7 years, I focused more on how I used what I had than on what I had. And the results are pretty obvious. Version A, I was focusing on what I had and a little less on how I was using it. Version B, I'm using GarageBand. I'm not worrying at all about what I have. I'm focusing only on how I'm using it. So let's start looking at Pro Tools versus GarageBand. Now, this is not going to be a feature breakdown of what all's in Pro Tools versus what all's in GarageBand. I'm sure someone else has done that, but ultimately it's a lot more helpful to talk about how we're actually using them. Again, it's more about how you use what you use than what you use. So instead, I'm going to go through all the major components: the master track processing, the vocals, the bass and electric guitars, and the drums. I'm not actually going to go through the synths because in this case, I'm not doing a lot on the synths. It's basically just getting the volumes and pan position set. They didn't really need much. But before we do that, I want to give you a gift. You can probably tell by now that if you want your music to sound great, you have to get great at mixing. So I want to give you something to help with that. I've put together a completely free 6-step checklist to a pro mix that just walks through all the components that all professional mixes have and how to do them inside GarageBand. Even if you're not a GarageBand user, this checklist is definitely still going to help you out. So be sure to grab it from the link in the description below. Again, it's completely free, so be sure to grab it. Okay, let's get into it. Okay, we're in Pro Tools first, and first up we have master track processing. So the master track is a single stereo track that all of the tracks in your session run through. Just a little processing here can really improve your overall mix. I always set this up as soon as I finish setting my volumes in a static mix so that I can mix into it. Let's look at what we've done here in Pro Tools. So this track right here, the submix, is our master track, and these are all the plugins that we have on it. So the bottom two here have to do kind of just with bringing up the total volume or controlling the total volume. The last one is a trim, which is essentially a gain plugin. So my mix had actually gotten a little loud, so I'm turning the total mix down a little bit here. And then this last one is just a limiter. So we can ignore those because they're not really doing anything to the sound here. We're going to focus on all of these plugins here. Let's start with the top here. This is EQ. This is more or less always my first move on the master track. Let's listen to what this plugin alone is doing.
Instead of crying at the table, instead of giving out the names, instead of lying that you're stable.
Nothing crazy. So we have a bit of a bump here in the upper mids here, a little bit of a cut in the low mids around a 200 hertz, a little bump kind of down right around the sub frequencies, just before the sub frequencies, and then a low roll off down in the low bass so that it doesn't extend on forever. So pretty basic. Then we have, this is the Slate bus compressor collection, and I like to stack a couple of these and just let it run through the circuitry of these because these are analog emulated pieces that add some nice subtle saturation to a mix.
Instead of crying at the table.
So I'm really only doing a little bit of compression up here and down here, nothing in this middle one. So just a subtle amount of compression. Listen to this with this off and on.
Instead of crying at the table, instead of giving out the names.
Okay, it's kind of crazy what all this plugin can do. Focus on the snare and notice how it just adds crack to it.
Instead of crying at the table, instead of giving out the names.
Yeah, we're not doing a lot of compression, but this is really bringing a presence forward in the mix. It's really cool. It's a great plugin, but you don't have to have it for sure. Okay, here we have Virtual Mix Rack by Slate. We're just using something, this is in their free plugin list, Shimmer and Thickness. So this is adding just a little kind of brightness and a little bit of low end.
Instead of crying at the table, instead of giving out the names.
Okay, so subtle, but definitely helps. Doing just a little bit of a reverb here. So this is a trick I used to do. I haven't really done it in a long time, but just a 3% mix on this reverb. You might not even be able to hear this.
Instead of crying at the table, instead of giving out the names.
Exaggerate it.
Instead of lying that you're stable, instead of pushing it away. And you say it's just to get out, yeah, it's just to get out.
I don't really hear it in the context, but it probably helps fill out the space a little bit. You could have done this a lot of ways. This was an easy way. I remember doing a lot around this time. And then we have a virtual tape machine. This is from Slate again. So 3 of these plugins are ones I had to buy separately. They weren't included in Pro Tools. They're all pretty expensive plugins.
Instead of crying at the table, instead of giving up.
Check out what this does to the low mids.
Instead of crying at the table, instead of giving out the names.
Definitely help a lot. And then that's it. So those are our entire plugins. Listen to it. I'll turn them all off and then turn them all back on.
Instead of crying at the table, instead of giving out the names. Instead of lying that you're stable, instead of pushing it away. And you say it's just to get out, yeah, it's just to get out. Out of the figure.
It's kind of crazy. Okay, so really doing a lot of heavy lifting in the mix just on the master track. And you can see why it's important to mix into these because they really affect the sound. Okay, let's go ahead and look at what we did in GarageBand. Okay, to get to your master track in GarageBand, you can select any track, hit B on your keyboard, and then you just click over to master. And then you have your plugin list for your master track. You can also show your master track by holding Shift, Command, and M. That's going to show or hide your master track down here. That can be helpful as well, and you can just click on it and hit B, and you'll get your settings right here as well. So this gives us our plugin list. So here we have a gain plugin, which is the same as a trim plugin like we had in Pro Tools, so we won't talk much about that. We have this, which I'm just doing a little bit of something called clipping to trim off the top end, which is really, again, more about loudness and volume control. And then a limiter, which again is just adding a little bit more volume. So those three don't matter. And then the MV Meter 2 is literally just a metering plugin. So we're just looking at volume. So the only two plugins on my master track here are the EQ and this compressor. This is a free compressor from Analog Obsession called the Buster SE. And this is a great master bus compressor that's completely free. So let's play a little bit and I'll bypass both of these and then turn them back on.
Instead of crying at the table, giving out the names, instead of lying that you're stable, instead of pushing it away, and you say it's just to get out, yeah, it's just to get out of the figure.
It's kind of crazy. It's so much fuller with these on. It's really amazing what they do, and they're not doing a lot. So if we look at this EQ, first of all, let's just say this EQ looks so much better than the Pro Tools EQ. I find it so much easier to set, and as a built-in analyzer, which the Pro Tools EQ didn't, back when I used it at least. To be honest, since I've switched over to Logic, I haven't used Pro Tools nearly as much, but this is a really great EQ. So let's see what just this EQ is doing. We're doing a little bit down in the sub range, a little bit in the low mids, a slight bump up in these kind of upper mid-range area kind of, and then just a little bit of brightness at the very top. So I'll turn this off and back on.
Instead of crying at the table, instead of giving out the names,
I mean,
instead of lying that you're
so subtle what we're doing here. 1 dB, 1 dB, 1 dB. Yeah, 2 dBs. This is the biggest boost, and it's only less than 2 decibels. And it totally fills out the sound. It's awesome. And then the Buster SE, so this is a great analog style compressor, so similar to those Slate compressors, a different emulation, but it still has that analog character and brings something to the mix while compressing it and kind of gluing it all together. So check out this off and on.
Instead of crying at the table, instead of giving out the names,
so very little compression like we were doing in Pro Tools.
instead of lying that you're
So just on some of the bigger hits. And it moves into this next section, we'll see it kick on a little bit more.
And you say it's just to get out, yeah, it's just to get out
Turn this off.
of the figure. And now you're saying
Back on.
you're proud, yeah, you're saying you're proud.
Yeah, I mean, it really helps fill it out. So we're not doing as much here as we did in Pro Tools, but you can still see it's kind of making just as much difference. We're really just using a little bit of subtle EQ, a little bit of subtle analog style compression, and using these two things really help fill out the mix and glue it together, which is the goal of what we're trying to do on the master track. Okay, let's jump back over to Pro Tools and check out the drums. Okay, so here are the drums we did in Pro Tools. We have kick in, kick out, snare top, snare bottom, tom 1, tom 2, so rack tom, floor tom, overheads, and then I only had a mono room mic, but I kind of turned it into a stereo sound of a room mic. Worked okay. Now, keep in mind, if you need to record drums, it is a lot of microphones, it's a lot of mic stands, it's a lot of mic cables. You have to get an interface that can do all those channels. It's a really big, expensive endeavor to record live drums. And then you have to edit them all, which is a whole process in and of itself. So I would have done a fair amount of quantizing, especially because we were using some virtual instruments here. It needed to be pretty locked in with the timing of the song, a little bit more than if it was just a free-floating rock song, if you will. And then in this case, this is where I do think if you have to record live drums, you really benefit from getting something like Logic or Pro Tools, because being able to do what's called bus processing, which is essentially master track processing, but only for these tracks, can be really helpful. So in this case, we have all these tracks that kick through the room. Then we have a drum bus, and this has processing on it similar to the master track that all these drums running through are hitting. And then we have a parallel where we've sent, looks like the kick and the snare to this crush, which is essentially parallel compression, which I'll show you we also did in GarageBand in a different way. I'll show you that in just a second. And then we have a drum reverb, which is just additional drum reverb. So the drums from the bus here are being sent to this drum reverb. So pretty complex routing. This is why it can get confusing quickly. It's better to understand why you're doing it than just having the ability to do it, in my opinion. And there's a lot of great workarounds using things like GarageBand Drummer that we'll talk about in just a second. Okay, so let's just go through really quickly. We're not gonna go through everything here, but I do wanna show you what, if I take all this off, what the drums sound like without anything that sounds good on them. So let's just listen to the drums in solo here for 1 second. So there's no kick happening here. So we're not getting any of that, but they sound okay. A lot of this processing is coming from here. In my opinion, I was doing too much EQ on this. This is too much EQ for a master bus, or the drum bus, in my opinion. I should have addressed these issues more directly. But it's not bad, and it definitely, overall, it sounds okay. It definitely helps the sound in this case. I could have addressed that more on individual tracks and less on here. It would have sounded a little bit more natural. For example, the floor tom didn't necessarily need to be cut at this frequency, but there was something in that when I'm listening to it all together that's not working, so I cut a little bit too much here. The FG Gray, this is another one of those Slate digital compressors that I had to buy separately outside of Pro Tools. Doing a lot to the tone. And then VMR, this is again the revival like we had on the master track. A little bit of shimmer, a little bit of thickness. Just adding a little bit more crack to the snare, a little bit more body. And then Tape Machine, and this is adding a little bit of saturation and rounding it out a little bit so it's a little less pokey. Right? Pretty cool. Definitely does the trick. So these all off real quick and then back on. And then back on. All right, definitely help. Okay, so we have the drum reverb here. We can unsolo this, I'll solo that for just a second. Actually, it won't play because this is all done, so we'll mute this. So that's a drum reverb, just a reverb track. We'll take that off. The parallel compression. This is just really intense compression just on the kick and snare, essentially. So right here, it's just the snare. But it just makes it really pokey. We did a better version of this, in my opinion, on the GarageBand drums that we'll look at in just a second. And then just the drums by themselves without any of the other stuff. Take these off here. So no parallel compression or reverb here. There's reverb on this snare. Take that off, they feel really small. So let's listen to that with all of these things turned off really quickly. Woo! Mediocre. Right? So the processing really matters here. The processing definitely helped, but this is the reality. Recording drums is hard, and it takes a lot of time to get good at. And I will also say that even drums recorded in Pro Studio don't often sound great in totally raw form. Usually a little bit of processing on them really helps a lot, which is a big advantage of using something like GarageBand Drummer, where your starting point already sounds really good, and you can just shape it to fit in the mix a little bit better. Let's go ahead and jump over to GarageBand and look at what we did for the drums over there. All right, so we have our GarageBand drums here. We split this out into a kick, snare reverb, rack, floor, overhead, rooms, grit, which is kind of a drum distortion, parallel compression, and then the drum reverb. So very similar overall to what we had in Pro Tools, but we've just done it here with MIDI. Now, one thing I just want to say up top is if you're using GarageBand Drummer, you can still do all of this. You just have to create a MIDI track, and then you can copy your drummer track down to a MIDI track, and then you can do all the same processing. I've done a whole series on GarageBand drums. You can check out a playlist on my channel. I will take this off. Listen to just the drum track as it would come in GarageBand, and then the drums after we process them like this. sounds fine, but just super flat, right? Compared to, put this all together. A lot better, right? A lot bigger, a lot more depth to it. Kind of crazy. Okay, so let's look at what we've done here. On individual tracks, we've done a little bit of EQ. So just a little more low end, a little cut in the mid-range, a little around the click on the kick. A little bit of compression. We're using Fetish here. This is a great 1176 style compressor from Analog Obsession. And we're just using this to add a little bit of punch to the kick. Same on the snare, little bit of EQ, little bit of compression. Snare reverb, we can't do buses in GarageBand, so what I've done is I've just duplicated the snare track and added a reverb at the end and made it 100% reverb. So I can blend in that reverb signal as I would like, right? And that just fills out that snare sound a little bit more. The rack, we've just split this out to only be the rack tom hits on here. That gives me the option to EQ them so they're a little bit cleaner, a little bit bigger sounding, a little bit of compression so they sustain a little bit longer. Same with the floor tom, just a little bit of EQ, giving a little more low end, and then little compression so it sustains a little bit longer. Overheads, okay, so there are no overheads in GarageBand, so we're just emulating them. We're setting up our mix over here to kind of emulate it, really focusing more on the cymbals. And then we're EQing out some of the low end like you would have in overheads. You're not going to get as much low end overall in overheads. So we're cutting out some of the low end here. And then a little bit more EQ to bring out the brightness, the air frequencies up in the top on the cymbals. And then a little bit of compression. There's not a lot of compression happening here. Yeah, look at that. Half a decibel or something of compression. So just to contain it a little bit. And then the room, similar. We just kind of created a drum room sound. And here we're just using the Wooden Studio. I'll bring this up here. And then I'm using the Fetish to really make this kind of crazy. A lot of compression on here. If I turn off the solo. So nothing crazy. It's not a great sound in and of itself, but it helps blend in to make the drum sound bigger. Grit, we just have some distortion here. The parallel compression, so similar to what we did in Pro Tools, but we're doing it here with the Buster SE, which is the same as our master bus compressor. Right, and then here we're doing what's called New York style compression, where we're really exaggerating the low end and the high end to really have those punch out more on the drums. Take those off. Right, and then we're just mixing that in with our signal. And then drum reverb is just a straight up drum reverb.
Instead of giving out the names, instead of lying that you're stable.
So we can't do the bus processing like we did on the drums in Pro Tools, but we're just doing it all individually and we're kind of blending things together in their own way in GarageBand. So it's a bit of a workaround, but it still sounds great. And in the context of everything, it still sounds very real.
Just to get out, yeah, it's just to get out of the thick of it. And now you say you.
Okay, let's check out what we did for bass and guitars in Pro Tools. So here's our electric bass and guitars in Pro Tools. This is the same exact bass that you'll see in GarageBand in just a minute, but we're processing it a little bit differently over there. And then it's a few electric guitars. We recorded these with a real amp. I think it was probably my Sovtek MiG-50 through an Orange 212, probably into a 57, SM57 mic, and probably with some sort of distortion going into it, but not a lot. And I remember for this song, I borrowed a couple guitars from a buddy of mine so that I could have a few different tones just from the guitar side of it. But I didn't have access to something like GarageBand Amp Designer, which you'll see in a second, can give you a lot of really great tones very, very quickly that can really help fill out your song. Okay, so what do we have here? We have a bass, we have electric guitars, and then we again have a little bit of bus processing for all of the bass and guitars. The bass isn't running into this, but all the guitars are. Sounds okay. Sounds fine. Sounds fine. You'll see in the GarageBand version, we did a little bit more producing to make it sound a little bit different. The way we recorded the guitars is slightly different. But let's see what we've done processing-wise here. It's almost entirely EQ on the guitars. There's no compression on these electric guitars. I think these could have benefited from a little bit of a compression on individual tracks. But if we just go through, this is our EQ on one guitar, EQ on the second guitar. So pretty basic EQs. EQ on this guitar, pretty basic EQs, and then a little bit of compression on all the guitars. The bass has no EQ at all on it. That's surprising. The PSA1, this is a Sans amp. This is a little bit kind of mimicking a bass amp, kind of. It's really just adding a little bit of grit to it, and then some compression. So a lot of compression actually on this bass. Helps fill it out for sure. Some EQ would have helped if I would have just done some more in the sub range. That would really help fill out the low end of the song since this is our main bass source. And then this is helping for sure. Definitely helps the tone. I think this is emulating, yeah, an old SVT amp. Pretty cool. And then the guitar is very basic, a little bit of delay on this one, but otherwise it's just EQ and then this compression. Again, a fancy Slate digital compressor. Could have been using the stock Pro Tools compressor, but I had to have my fancy plugins. And it sounded fine. It definitely is helping, but it's not a game changer. Let's look at what we've done in GarageBand for the bass and guitars. So here's our bass and guitar in GarageBand. It's the same electric bass, and then we tracked a new left guitar and a new right guitar, and a couple other guitars at other points in this song, but that's the main part in this section, just so that we could use the amp designer to show you how many great tones you can get in GarageBand. So we have totally different amp configurations going on in the left and the right ears, and it's all built into GarageBand. It's wild, it's crazy, totally free. And then we have a lead track, and then these are some tails actually pulled from the original lead track because we had this weird synth pedal that would allow us to mix in these synth tails at the end of our signal. It was really cool. We don't have that pedal anymore. We could have tracked with that pedal into this amp if we did, but we didn't. So I just pulled them and I just kind of automated up these tails where I wanted them to be. It's a really cool effect. But check these out. Right? A lot more low end than we had in the Pro Tools guitars and bass. And in my opinion, these guitars just sound better. They have a better tone. Part of it is performance. It's definitely better performance. But another part of it is just better tones that we found. And we were able to do that because we had access to everything inside GarageBand, which is wild. So going through it really quickly, we have the bass here. Now, at certain points, I'm automating up an octave on this whammy pedal because I wish I'd done that in the original performance, but this allowed me to create that effect. Really, really cool. And then we have this bass amp. Now, GarageBand has great bass amps. They're the same as in Logic, and they sound awesome. I really like the tone of this bass amp. Right? A lot of good low end coming out of this thing. And you can really just tailor it where you want. You could also have a full cabinet. You could have an 810 or a 115. All sorts of options on the cabinet, multiple options on the head. Really, really good stuff. And then you get EQ. So here we're just driving up the low end sub information to make it really fill out the sub in this mix well. Notching a weird frequency here and then just cutting out a little bit of the upper frequencies. Right? Really helps shape it. The fetish is just controlling the dynamics. Takes away a little bit of the punch, gives it a little more sustain. I think this is a much better sounding compressor than we had set in Pro Tools. And then this TDR Nova is just a dynamic EQ that's completely free, that is helping us just contain a little bit of this low end. When a couple notes are played, they get a little extreme, and this just helps tamp them down a little bit. I don't know if you'll see it here. Yeah, just a little bit. On some notes, it won't touch it, and other notes, it will touch it a little bit more, right? So it's just a way to help make it a little bit more consistent in a specific frequency range. Okay, then we have two guitars. We have a left and right guitar. I'll turn off these verbs for now. We'll talk about those in 1 second. So these are great. Amp Designer, We just went crazy. We just really blasted these out using the distortion from the amp. There's no distortion going into these, totally clean. And then we just played around with configurations until we got ones that we like, right? And they're a little bit different guitars going into them, but then different amps. So especially if you only have one guitar, you can get drastically different tones in your left and right ears that complement each other to help give you more width in your mix. And then just a little bit of EQ here, a little bit of notching on a couple frequencies that were sounding a little weird up in this upper range. And then I think on this one, yeah, just cutting out the lows and the highs, and that's it. Really, really simple. And then a little bit of compression. Just containing the dynamics a little bit, right? So if they ever get a little bit too loud, it just tamps them down a little bit. So just make it a little bit more consistent. And then this is like my favorite reverb trick. I just duplicated each of these tracks, and at the end of it, added this space designer, which is a reverb, made it 100% wet. And now it's like we're in a guitar room, right? And so all I did is I took the left track, duplicated it, added reverb, panned it to the right. So it's now sounds like you're standing, amp on your left, amp bouncing off the wall, hitting your right ear, right? Gives us a much more realistic space around these guitars in the song. And then the lead here, we've got a lot going on. A little bit of graphic EQ just to take out some harsh frequencies, add in a little fullness down here around 400 hertz. And so what's really cool is if you need a little more tone shaping, you can do it. Just throw this pedal board on. You have all these options. It's wild. And then amp designer here, and we're just blasting it again. We're bringing out these really high frequencies so that we can do this nice lead part. Little bit of EQ, highlighting some frequencies that help it cut through in the mix. Little stereo delay, little ping pong back and forth left and right ear. Turn that off. Right, tucks it back a little bit, gives it a little bit of width. And then we have a cool space delay, or space designer reverb, just more reverb on it. Yeah, it's cool. Nothing crazy, but you add that all together and you get really full sounding guitars. Instead of giving out the names. Big fan. It's amazing what you can do with the amp designer and pedal board in GarageBand. You can get great tones and it's kind of limitless. Okay, let's jump back over to Pro Tools and look at what we did on the vocals. Okay, here are our vocals in Pro Tools. So we don't have a lot of tracks going on here. We have the lead vocal track, we have a double of it, and we have a left and right. And then we have them all running through this bus. So similar again to the master track processing, these are all hitting the same bus.
Instead of crying at the table.
And I could do processing here, but I'm not. I didn't think it was necessary because I'm just processing individually on each track. And then we have a reverb and a delay. So if I include those here.
Instead of crying at the table.
Just adds a little bit to the vocals. One thing you can see in Pro Tools is that we can do what's called clip gain, which is where I can turn this section down. I just get a little fader and I can turn this section up or down. It's a really, really handy feature. And you have to work around not having this feature in GarageBand, but you can do it just by putting a gain plugin here and then doing automation in the exact same way. It takes a little bit longer, but it ultimately can produce the same results. And I actually think I would not approach this the same way that I was approaching it here now, because what I'm doing is I'm making the incoming volume of this signal quieter before it's hitting these plugins, meaning that when I hit my compressor, this isn't going to be compressed really at all, and it's going to be really quiet, which is fine. It should be quiet, but I'd rather mix it quiet after the processing that's necessary to really make it a little bit more consistent. So I don't think I would use clip gain in this same way that I did very often back then, which is essentially trying to mix on it. I do a lot more of that with my volumes automating at the end. But let's check out what we have on these vocals. So on the lead vocal here, we have a very interesting EQ. You'll see it's very different than what we end up having in the GarageBand vocal in just a second. I'm really cutting a lot of low mids and low end out of this vocal. Nothing else on it. It's really just cutting this out. I'm not doing any boost to, make it more present in the mix. And then some compression.
Instead of crying at the table.
So I'm reducing a little over 3 decibels
Instead of giving
here.
out the names.
And I think, yeah, I didn't really understand compression this time, so I was just using a preset and just looking for 3 or 4 decibels of compression.
Instead of crying at the table,
Take that off.
instead of giving out the names,
It definitely helps bring it forward. I think it's probably adding a little bit of volume too. If I take off both of these,
instead of crying at the table, instead of giving out the names,
you know, more present, but functionally just because I've taken out all the mids and low end from it. Where if I really wanted this vocal to sound full yet present, what I would likely do, and what you'll see in GarageBand, is I would leave the low mids in, which will keep it sounding full, but then I would boost some of the upper frequencies, kind of the air, the brightness, but I'm not doing that here because that would be adding more harshness. Listen to how harsh this S already is here.
instead of giving out the names.
So I need to address that with the de-esser, which we'll go over more in GarageBand. And then I'm using the BF76, which is an 1176 style compressor, which you can get a free version of and use in GarageBand that I'm definitely using a lot better than I was using this one here. So check out this one.
Instead of crying at the table,
Just a little bit of compression, it looks like.
instead of giving out the names.
Yeah, I'm not really using this right here. I'll just say it. I think I could have used compression a lot better on this mix if I understood what I know now. Compression's a big part of making things sound full and present and forward in the mix. And then our other vocals, I'm cutting out all the high end and some low end. I mean, this is, I would do this on some vocals now, but didn't necessarily need to do that on this double. Compressor, again, here is probably
Instead of crying
not,
at the table,
yeah, it's barely kicking on there.
instead of giving out the names.
But then as we get to the end of this line,
Instead, and you say it's just to get out. Yeah, it's just
coming on
to get
a lot,
out.
right? 6 decibels. So because it's quiet here, because I use a clip gain, it's quieter there, louder here. A big volume difference and a big compression difference there. And then these vocals here, very bright EQ, a big bump up here around 5,000 hertz. And again, how much better is the GarageBand EQ? It's so funny to me.
And you
So yeah,
say it's
these vocals
just
are
to
really
get
bright
out.
out
Yeah,
here.
it's just to get out.
And then I have a little bit of reverb. So if I bring up this reverb, let's bring these back in. Bring up this reverb here.
Instead of crying at the table,
Good sounding reverb, sounds fine.
instead of giving out the names,
EQ in it a little bit after, which you can do in
instead of lying
GarageBand
that you're stable,
too. And then a little bit of delay here.
instead of crying at the table.
What's that delay doing? We have a lot more intentional delay set in GarageBand. So let's actually jump over to GarageBand and look at what we've done in the vocals over there. Okay, so here are our vocals in GarageBand. We have a vocal lead. We have some effects. So these 3, 4 are all effects. And then we have the double and the left and the right. The exact same ones that we had in Pro Tools, just now in GarageBand. So let's check it out.
Instead of crying at the table, instead of giving out the names, instead of lying that you're stable, instead of pushing it away, and you say it's just to get out. Yeah, it's just to get out.
Okay, pretty cool, right? So obviously these vocal delays are probably going to jump out at you. We'll talk about those in 1 second. Let's start by talking about this lead vocal track. So in Pro Tools, we cut out all the low mid information in the vocal, which made it sound really thin. Compare that to this lead vocal that has a lot of body to it,
Instead of crying at the table,
but it also has brightness.
instead of giving out the names,
Cut out some weirdness here in the mid range.
instead of lying that you're stable,
Take this off.
instead of crying at the table,
Add it back on.
instead of crying at the table.
It's really contained, really full sounding. So this EQ makes a lot more sense to me. It's very specifically set for this vocal. This might not work on your vocal, but with this vocal, this is what I want it to have. It has body, it has brightness, it's totally working. But when you start adding brightness, you're going to start getting more sibilance from your S's. So we've also used a couple de-essers to tame it at specific frequencies here. And then we're using this TDR Nova. Again, it's a dynamic EQ.
Instead of crying at the table,
To basically just cut down on those upper frequencies anytime it goes past a certain threshold. So it's basically a de-esser containing those sibilant frequencies and only those sibilant frequencies. That way it can be bright when he's not hitting S's,
instead of crying at the table,
but when he's hitting S's and T's and other sibilant
instead of giving
sounds,
out the names,
it will cut them down just a little bit. We have Fetish, which is an 1176 style compressor, and here is how I think vocal compression really shines. So it's a slow attack on 1176 style compression, which is still really fast, but it lets that initial hit of the word through. Then it's a fast release, so it will let off immediately, and that's going to help all the subtleties of the individual words come through.
Instead of crying at the table,
right?
Instead of giving out the names,
helps make it sound full, and it just makes it more consistent while still being a little bit punchy. And then we did a little bit more TDR Nova, adding more brightness
instead
here.
Of crying at the table.
And also containing those frequencies again. And then one more, because I was still this one frequency that was poking out to me.
Instead of crying at the table.
And that just helped me control it. You can actually solo this here. This is what was bothering me.
Instead of crying at the table.
So just containing that a little bit. And then we added some effects. So I just duplicated that track. Let's start by talking about the effects that are always on. So we have a slapback delay. This is just left and right slapback stereo delay.
Instead of crying at the table.
This is adding a little bit body and width around the lead vocal.
Instead of crying at the table.
And then we have a mono slapback delay.
Instead of crying at the table.
So that's that really fast slapback delay.
Instead of crying at the table.
And I've set these just by duplicating these tracks, and then I add these effects on them. So here we have a stereo delay. Here we have just the tape delay.
Instead of crying at the table.
That gives me a really fast delay, which still gives an immediate sound as opposed to something really long. Makes it a little bit higher, adds some energy and warmth to the vocal. And then we have a little bit of reverb.
Instead of crying at the table.
So this is a longer reverb.
Instead of giving out the names.
Same approach, we just duplicated it and made this 100%
Instead
wet
of lying
reverb.
that you're stable.
And then EQ'd a little bit after.
Instead of pushing it away.
So similar to what we did in Pro Tools, but we don't have a bus here, so we just duplicated the track and made this a parallel reverb track. And then we have this really cool long delay just on specific words. So I just pulled down those words and put them where I wanted to be. And then it gives us this cool...
Table.
And
Instead of giving out the names.
It's actually through a pedal board. So I'm using
Instead
distortion,
of lying that you're stable.
this delay, and then the vibe, which just has a cool tone.
Instead of crying at the table.
Yeah, it's cool. So it just gets a little more distorted as it goes, as it delays on. And then a little bit of EQ to make it fit in the context of the mix.
Instead of crying at the
and then we just have the double, which here is
instead of crying at the table.
Just some basic de-essing, little bit of EQ here, specific to this vocal. A little more de-essing, and then the La, which is a great analog style compressor from Analog Obsessions, completely free. Love this thing.
Instead of crying at the table.
Just helps contain the dynamics of this vocal a little bit. And then we have the left and right vocal. Add these together.
Just to get out. Yeah, it's just to get out.
Nothing crazy, but you put it all together with the lead vocal and the effects.
Just to get out. Yeah, it's just to get out.
Put them in the context of the mix.
Out of the thick of it. Now you're saying you're proud, yeah, you're saying you're proud. We're all getting sick of it, yeah.
Right? Sounds pretty good. So can you create professional sounding vocals in GarageBand? Absolutely. Now, you might be getting the idea by now that in either DAW, we're doing the same thing. We're using plugins to shape the tone and dynamics with EQ and compression, then creating space with reverb and delay. It looks a little bit different, but it's the same in either DAW. The difference comes in how well you understand and use the tools, and less about what tools you are using. When I mixed this song in Pro Tools, I hadn't learned to use them as well. When I mixed this song in GarageBand, I'm setting them better, which ultimately gave us a better sounding final result. Also in GarageBand, we have really great sounding virtual amps that allowed us to really dial in better tone on the front end. Even though I was using a nice amp in the original song, it wasn't the bright, crunchy tone this song needed. Again, when I stopped worrying about what I was using, in this case my fancy amp, and focused more on how I was using what I had, I got a better final product. At the end of the day, if your DAW allows you to set volumes and pan positions, add plugins, and ideally master track processing and automation, you can use it to create great sounding music. All the complex routing and bus processing in Pro Tools is nice, it can help, but it's not make or break. Okay, now that we've gone through all the individual parts, let's listen through one more time to the Pro Tools mix versus the GarageBand mix.
Instead of crying at the table, instead of giving out the names, instead of lying that you're stable, instead of pushing it away, and you're say it's just to get out, yeah, it's just to get out of the thick of it. And now you're saying you're proud, yeah, you're saying you're proud. We're all getting sick of it, yeah.
So, what do you think? Can you create professional sounding music in GarageBand? I certainly think so. Now, if you've made it this far into this video, I know you're really serious about creating professional sounding music, and I have something really exciting and time sensitive that I want to tell you about. I just opened my complete course on mixing called the Ultimate GarageBand Mixing Course, and it closes tomorrow. You'll get to go with me week by week through the exact system that I follow to consistently create great sounding mixes. And this is the first time I've opened this course to the public, so there's a bunch of great founders bonuses included as well. If you're interested in joining before we close it tomorrow, be sure to check out the details at the link in the description below. By the way, if you're a Logic user, there's actually a complete crash course on mixing in Logic that's going to be included as well. Kind of crazy bonus if you ask me. And if you don't mix in GarageBand or Logic, there's still a lot of great information because it's always the same fundamentals no matter where you're mixing. Obviously, it's going to look a little bit different because I'm teaching in GarageBand, but the fundamentals are the same in whatever DAW you're mixing in. So if you're interested, maybe check it out as well. And if you don't already have it, be sure to grab my 6-step checklist to a pro mix. There's a link in the description below. It's really going to help you out. So be sure to grab that. It's completely free. If this video is helpful, be sure to like, comment, subscribe. I'll see you next week with another video.
One thing at a time.